Welcome, everybody. I'm Julia Rogers. I've had the pleasure of talking with some of you already today, and I'm happy to see you here too, because we're going to take a nice deep dive into what is a gap year and how to take one and what elements to think about as you plan whatever it's going to look like for you. And I know this is the last session of the day, but I'm not bringing last session energy. I'm going to bring first session energy to all of you and keep the energy up. And I think that one of the great things about a gap year is that it's whatever you want to make of it, and so that makes talking about it super fun, and it's all about choice. So, obviously all of you have come today to the College and Career Pathways to answer a tiny little question, and that's, what are you going to do with your life, right? And I think that this is a question that is often asked of our young people very unfairly, because we put a lot of pressure on teens as a society to, for some reason, know, like you should know, what you want to do with your life as you approach high school graduation. But we, of course, know that why would you? That's totally unfair. And so, really what a gap year is at its essence is an opportunity to kind of give yourself that longer runway to figure out not necessarily what you want to do with your life, but how to make the best decisions about your next steps in life and how to feel more confident as a person and how to have more clarity about your own values and how you see yourself in the world and the kind of life that you want to create for yourself. And that, to me, is the most exciting part about this. Actually, I'm probably going to say that phrase, that's the most exciting part for me about this, a couple times. But speaking of which, I'm just going to give you a little bit of my credentials. Why am I here today talking to all of you? Well, I have spent my entire career basically doing this kind of work around the gap year option, educating about it, counseling students, talking about it online in many different forums, and hosting a podcast. So origin story is up there on the right-hand side. I took a gap year after college. So I graduated with a degree in English literature and no direction, didn't know what I wanted to do, but I did want to do some good in the world. And so I thought about joining the Peace Corps, got a little bit freaked out by 2 years of commitment, so I decided 1 year would be good, and decided to go to East Africa and do public health work for about a year with a nonprofit. That experience was, to say it was formative is an understatement. It was the most challenging, but the most educational experience of my life up until that point. And what that told me, especially as I looked around my cohort of other volunteers, there was Tanzanian volunteers, there were British and American and Australian volunteers, and some of those people were lucky enough to be on a gap year between high school and college. And I thought, if I'd had that experience before going to college, it would have completely reinformed that entire experience. I would have not only taken it more seriously, but I would have appreciated it so much more, especially watching the students that I worked with in my village in Tanzania walk 2 miles to high school. You just gain a different perspective on education in general, but also no matter what you do in a gap year, you gain perspective. So I founded my business en route soon after that, which is what I do. I help students create customized gap year itineraries, and I work with students all over the country, but of course my favorites are from Vermont. I also serve on our board of directors. I was former board chair, and that is the kind of industry governing body. So if you are looking at gap year programs and you see they have an accreditation seal, that's from the Gap Year Association. So they're a really great resource for the gap year option and the gap year movement. And I also host a podcast, which is in its 9th season right now. And so if you're hoping to hear from other students who've done really cool things on their gap year, and you like listening to podcasts while you walk your dog or while you're in between classes and stuff, that's a great resource too. So one of the ways I like to start these presentations is with shared language. One of the things I've noticed about Vermont is that sometimes students will use the term gap year as the fallback phrase when they don't know what they're doing after high school. No one in this room, obviously, but that is something that I hear sometimes from school counselors and things like that. So if you're taking a gap year, this is what it means. It means that you are taking an intentional period of time. It's not something that happens to you. It's something that you actively choose, and that you're going to be engaging in personal and professional exploration through experiential learning. So learning typically outside the classroom or learning through doing. And it's also this time to focus on this personal, practical, and professional development. And so that's really this, time in life where you are thinking about what makes you spark. What do you enjoy doing? How do you like to use your time? If someone asks you why you're going to college and you say, I don't know, it's just what you do. You're pre-qualified for a gap year. If you're young for your grade, you're pre-qualified for a gap year. If you want to see the world and see how other people live and learn about yourself, you're pre-qualified for a gap year. Basically, if I had my druthers, we would see probably like 85% of students taking a gap year between high school and college because of what you will all soon learn are the immense benefits to just taking time out of the typical traditional classroom experience and learning in different ways. So it's very much time on, but it's really fun time on because you get to choose the different things that you're going to be doing on your gap year. So I took a gap year after college. Why don't we just say do that instead? I think there's really no wrong time to take a gap year, whether it's between high school and post-secondary, between post-secondary and grad school or credentialing. Mid-career gap years are great. Post-career gap years are great. They're actually becoming more and more popular. But when you are 17, 18, 19 years old, there are some very crucial things that are happening in your development that make you particularly well advised to take a gap year. First of all, you are the most psychologically flexible you will be in your adult life. So that means that the experiences you have when you're this age are going to help shape your value system, they're going to help shape your adaptability, they're going to help shape your leadership skills. You're basically this open book, your mind is open. So the things that you get to do are going to help figure out who you want to be in a way that the world is not just happening to you, but you are actively engaging with the world. You're also, when we ask again people what they want to be when they grow up, you're usually limited to what you've experienced so far in life, which is somewhat limited. And so a gap year really allows you to explore in ways that are a little bit more deliberate. And sometimes if I have a student right now who's from Colorado and she wants to be a marine biologist, but she's in a landlocked state, you guys. She hasn't done any labs on the sounds of dolphins, using sonar equipment or anything like that. So a gap year allows her to explore that career path by doing field work, which is what she's planning on doing, in a real world situation to decide whether or not that being a marine biologist is actually what she wants to spend 4 to 8 years studying, depending on the path she chooses. You're also, who you are is often defined by where you go to school. And if you've had not a great high school experience, who you are can feel a little bit, maybe you aren't as happy with you are as you would be in the real world because high school is difficult. It could also be maybe you are a big town kid growing up in a rural community in Vermont and you want to break out and find where you belong. So thinking about this opportunity to figure out who your people are and who your environment is best suited to is what a gap year can be too. You're also in this moment where you are developing that sense of self-identity, and this is a time in life where before you go off and join another peer group or set of peer groups when you are in post-secondary education, this is your opportunity to go and seek out who you are in a way that's very unique to who you are as a person. That's pointing to your stomach because you're hungry for new experiences. Especially my Vermonters are always like, Vermont is amazing, it's safe, it's beautiful, but it's also, it's small, it's limited, right? You want to kind of break out and see new things and see new people. And you're also, most people, no matter what you do, you're excited but you're nervous to start on this new path, whether it's going straight to college or going to start an apprenticeship program or taking a gap year. So this is a stat that came out last fall, that came out in 2020, that 95% of gap year students said their gap year helped set them up well for the next step. And doesn't matter what they did on their gap year. They could have worked, they could have traveled, they could have done gap year programs, but they felt they were better prepared for their next step in life because of their gap year. And so if that's not a powerful statistic, I don't know what is, but we'll talk more stats in just a second. But first I want to talk about a gap year student. I'm going to be profiling a few gap year students over the course of this presentation because I think it really helps illustrate what you can actually do in a gap year. So Elsa was the kind of student who's had a father who was British, and the father called me up before she had decided to take a gap year and said, I think Elsa should really do a gap year, but she doesn't want to do a gap year. She wants to go straight to college. All her friends are going straight to college. That's what she feels like she should do. So she at least agreed to get on the phone with me, and we had a great conversation. At the end of it, she was like, oh, I guess I do want to take a gap year, okay. And then this is what she said after her gap year, which I love, because she was initially gap year hesitant, and for no other reason but besides she thought that she was meant to be on this kind of conveyor belt that goes straight to college and not really question why she might step off of that conveyor belt for a minute and just explore the world in a new way. And so when we started digging into planning, what she ended up wanting to do was see a lot of different cultures and develop some new skills, particularly in the outdoors. So first she spent 3 months in Nepal, and she was on a program where she was traveling with other gap year students, living in homestays. This is her doing a stone carving apprenticeship with a master stone carver outside of Kathmandu. She hiked in the Himalayas, and this is a program called Where There Be Dragons, where you can actually earn college credit as part of it and use 529 money to pay for it if you so choose. So that's what she did for her first semester. Then she came home for the holidays, rested, worked a little bit, and then she went to Costa Rica and was developing some credentials around outdoor education. So she was getting her whitewater rescue certification, she was getting her wilderness first responder certification, she was rappelling off waterfalls, she was hiking in the rainforest. She was doing all sorts of really cool outdoor activities and building a skill set for a hobby, for life. Then she wanted to kind of expand into something that was more independent and not part of a structured program. So she was doing some conservation volunteering and then backpacking with a friend throughout Australia and New Zealand for about 6 weeks. So all that is to say is that she did a lot. And most of those things were with different types of programs, and we'll talk about those kinds of programs in a minute. But she had this kind of progression of experiences. The first thing she did was the most structured, meaning that it was with a group, they had an itinerary that they followed, and she was kind of, being led. And then she kind of branched out more and more as her gap year went on to eventually traveling on her own across the world. So, what are some of the benefits for doing something like what Elsa did? Lots of benefits. This is all from that same survey as the 95% say that it was a great decision survey. This was a survey that was done, in 2020 from students who had done their gap year before 2020, so these aren't COVID gappers. But they surveyed over 3,000 people. They surveyed people who had done things like AmeriCorps, they had done travel-based programs, they had surveyed people who did work-based programs. So it did not matter what you did on your gap year or how much you spent on your gap year. These are the outcomes that we saw, especially these interpersonal ones. So more confidence, more motivation, more people who have better communication and leadership skills, people who are more civically engaged after their gap year, but also students who have a lot more clarity about their choice of career and also who feel like they have skills that make them more competitive in the job market. And I can tell you that as someone who has taken a gap year and then used it in job interviews later, it has definitely worked to my advantage. It really sets you apart when you have an anecdote about, like speaking Swahili, or I had another situation where I was traveling in Southeast Asia, and I wrote about that in a cover letter to get a job at a literacy foundation, because I had been bringing books to, when I was in Southeast Asia, my husband and I were bringing books to people who were under-resourced in different villages. We were just carrying the books for this organization to these remote villages. The guy who runs this literacy foundation I was applying to also did the same thing when he was traveling through Southeast Asia. We made that connection. I got the job. It was really cool. So those kinds of things can actually be more of a competitive advantage in the anecdotal ways than you'd think. This survey was done last fall by USA Today, which I think is really important because you guys are the part of this generation that has not yet lived with regret. So there's still hope for you. But this was part of a larger survey about attitudes around higher education and, do people still think that there's value in higher education? And most people, especially Gen Z, do think there's value in higher ed. But those same people surveyed, nearly half of them said they regretted not taking a gap year. And so it's important to think about the internal mechanisms at play for people not deciding to take a gap year. I think a lot of it has to do with the knowledge gap, or assuming that it has to be expensive, or not knowing where to go for resources. But luckily no one in this room and no one watching on Zoom has that excuse anymore. So by the end of this, you'll have a lot of tools to figure out what you're going to do with your gap year if you take one. So the other limitation that I sometimes hear about, and this can be from school counselors, this can be from students, this can be from parents even, is a gap year's not right for me. It's cool. Gap years are really cool, but they're not for me. And that's maybe not true. And I'm going to illustrate this for you through the many roles and the diverse, filmography of Timothée Chalamet. So there are a lot of different people who take gap time for different reasons. Now, this Timothy, if anyone recognizes this, is the Timothy from Dune. Timothy from Dune is a worker. Timothy from Dune has really high test scores, high GPAs, is applying to highly selective schools, and is probably highly at risk for burnout. So these are students who are going to be going for highly competitive schools and are usually working themselves to the bone and need a rest. And so these are typically students who, if they do get into a highly competitive school, will defer admission, take a gap year, and start a year later way more refreshed. So those students are really good. A gap year is really good for those students because it allows them some time to learn who they are outside of their academic achievements. And they often do some really cool things in their gap year because they're naturally curious. Now we have our meaning seeker our meaning seeker Timothy. This is a Timothy who, if you recognize this one from Little Women, Laurie was very smart, but not super motivated at the beginning of the movie, if you'll so recall. And that is the same with meaning seekers. So these are the types of students who typically have high test scores, but not always high GPAs. They're smart, they're bright, but they have to like what they're doing in order to dig into it. So if they don't like their English class, then they're gonna tank. If they don't want to do soccer, they're not gonna show up for practice. And so a gap year for these students really allows them to choose what they dig into. It allows them to follow their curiosities in new ways, and also allows them to develop the perspective that they need so that if they do go to college, and most do, they'll show up in the ways that they need to show up because they'll understand it's part of a higher purpose. Now this Timothy. This is our floater Timothy. This is from Don't Look Up, if any of you remember that movie. So our floater Timothy is gonna be someone who, if you just put him day one on a college campus, he's not thriving, right? He's probably not showing up for class. He's probably not gonna be, he's not self-motivated yet. He has not discovered the reason that he's there, the why. And so that Timothy's motivation for his year is going to be to discover the why. And sometimes that means maybe they are or they are not appropriate for a college degree. Maybe they're going to be practicing some other things to figure out what else they're going to be pursuing after their gap year. Or they might be doing programs that help them develop the skills in order to thrive as an adult independently. So if this student is maybe struggling with failure to launch or something like that, they may have to go into a program that really helps give them, some more mentorship and support so they can function as an adult in the world. Now we have our pragmatist Timothy. This guy is from The King, which is a movie about Henry VIII as a young person. And so this is someone who is got his eye on the prize. He knows that he wants to go to post-secondary education, whether it's college or credentialing or anything else. But he wants to know why he's there. He is very practical. He understands that college is expensive, it's an investment, and I want to know my course of study on day one, or at least be moving in that direction by the time I start. So this kind of Timothy is going to be working towards professional development and career exploration on their gap year. And if you've noticed, you might recognize many Timothys in yourself. And because a lot of this generation are very pragmatic about higher ed and wanting to make sure they're making good choices. We have our Wonka adventurer, Timothy, and this is going to be the kind of person who wants to travel, wants to see new places, wants to make all sorts of chocolate everywhere and basically just have a good time and experience a lot of new things. And this is the type of person I identify strongly with Wonka in that way, in that I feel like it took me a few years to sink into my college life. And if I had taken a gap year and kind of scratched my itchy feet before college, I probably would have just settled into that experience and enjoyed it a lot more because I would have felt like I've seen and done more first. And then lastly, we have our soul searcher. And so this Timothy has been through some stuff, and a lot of high schoolers have been through some stuff. Could be mental health challenges, could be a physical ailment that knocked them out of school for a while. It could be bereavement, it could be they lost somebody, or they've just dealt with other types of things. Sometimes people go through some really heavy stuff in their high school experience, and they need a year to get well, or to just develop, reclaim some of those experiences that they maybe lost out on in high school. And so with these kind of 6 profiles, you'll notice that through one or more, you might notice that most people could probably benefit from a gap year for one reason or another. And the people who I'd say probably aren't the right fit for a gap year are people who are so excited to start college on day one, or so excited to start that apprenticeship on day one, or so excited to go to CCV on day one, they can't imagine doing anything else. And they know why they're there, and they know what they want to study when they're there. So again, that's not too many people we know. We probably know a couple, but not that many. For the rest of us, Timothys, we press on. So, what can you do on a gap year? I know a lot of you have visited my table already, and so you may have seen this graph already. But the cool thing about a gap year is that there are so many more things than you probably have even thought about that you can do on a gap year. Let's start with programs. So the thing about programs is that you sign up for them, and they are pre-arranged for you in some way. Sometimes there is a cost attached. Usually there's a cost attached, I'll say, but not always. Do you have a question? I have to tell my participants to make sure there's a mic. So go for it, yeah.
Okay, so for these programs, you'd mentioned earlier that some of these, I want to clarify, can you use your 529 funding toward these?
So let's talk about that in the first section. So are these programs? Yes. So these types of programs, I'm calling them experiential semesters because usually they are a semester in length. A lot of these types of programs, I can give some examples. They're affiliated with an institution of higher learning, which means that they have accreditation, they can give out credit, and therefore you can route your 529 money through them. So examples would be ones you probably know about already: Outward Bound, Knowles, Where There Be Dragons. A lot of these programs actually, you can get, with Knowles, you're getting a credit in outdoor leadership, for example. But you can use that 529 money to get that leadership skill, which is really cool. And so with these experiential semesters, typically they are fixed length, so they're usually between 6 and 12 weeks long. You're with a small cohort of other gap year students, and there's a focus. So the focus might be outdoor education. The focus might be language immersion. The focus might be service learning and moving around to different places and experiencing different things like Elsa did. So these are the types of programs that are the most structured of what's on offer, and they're typically the more expensive ones, but they also do have that college credit attached. By more expensive, I mean the cost of a semester of regular college. These are going to set a student up for more independent experiences later on in their year. They're also really good for students who need to develop interpersonal skills, leadership skills, life skills. Then there's volunteering, and you can do volunteering close to home or away from home or abroad. But when we're talking about a volunteer program, we're talking about an organization that helps facilitate and train you properly and keep you, house you and that kind of thing away from home. So if you're interested in working with kids or in education, you can go in, work in a community development project. You can teach English in Thailand or Costa Rica. If you're interested in conservation, this is a Vermont student named Piper, and that's her volunteering with wildlife in Thailand. She was working at a wildlife sanctuary. You could also work with monkeys in South Africa. You could work in reforestation in Ecuador. There are endless opportunities for you to build a skill set while giving back to a community and doing it ethically. So with these types of projects, you're usually picking your length of time. So with human-facing projects, you want to choose as long as possible. If you can go for a few months, that's great, or even longer. With animals, they're not going to know as much if you come and go. So if you want to go work at a wildlife sanctuary for a few weeks or a little bit longer than that, you can go for a shorter length of time. So, and those usually do have a cost attached. And sometimes people are like, ugh, paying for volunteering? That's crazy. But you're not really paying to volunteer. You're paying to have the infrastructure ready for you so that you can show up. There are people to train you properly. There are people to take you to a clinic if you get sick. And there's people that are making sure that you're doing work that is contributing to the mission of the organization. So think of it more as you're helping facilitate the mission of the program by paying into the program. Then we have enrichment courses, and this is often helping a student develop what they want to do for their own hobbies or a skill set that they're trying to work on. So think getting your scuba diving certificate, or learning how to code a certain coding language that you want to try out, or getting a building certificate or another type of certification. It's could be something for you just for fun, or it could be something that builds towards that career exploration. Then there's national service. That's AmeriCorps. We have AmeriCorps programs here in Vermont. If you've heard of Serve, Earn, Learn, Serve, Learn, Earn, one of those combinations. Vermont Youth Conservation Corps, those kinds of things are technically AmeriCorps programs, meaning that they're not only free, so you get a stipend, so you're earning some money while you're doing these kinds of experiences, but you also get an education award that you can use towards college or other types of post-secondary education at the end of your service. The only asterisk to this is that funding is a little bit up in the air right now for reasons that I think we probably all know. So we have to kind of hope for the best with national service programs, but there are so many that serve communities all over the country. So if you don't want to be in Vermont, but you want to go serve and teach in under-resourced schools in Chicago, that's a city year. That's a really cool program that you can do. If you want to learn how to build trails and work in natural resources, you could do NCCC, which is a year-long program where you get to work all over a certain region of the country. So lots of things there. And then we have interning. So interning, you might think like, oh, my mom's buddy is an attorney, I can get him coffee and see how lawyers do stuff. But there's actual internship programs that will take your resume, figure out like what industries you want experience in, and then match you with an internship that actually gives you a lot of resume building skills. And you can also do it, there are programs here in the States, but you can also do it abroad. So I have a lot of students that will intern in Spain or Cape Town, South Africa, or Dublin, Ireland, or Argentina, and get an international or cultural experience while also building the resume. So those are all things that you can do on your gap year that are programmatic. There's also a whole slew of things that you can do that you design yourself. So think independent travel, traveling with a friend, not with a program, or on your own. This is, sometimes people are like, just traveling on your gap year, but yes, think about the problem solving and the budgeting and the other things, the life skills that you gain when you are meant to get from point A to point B and to manage yourself and to manage all the risk and to manage the food and lodging and all the other things that come with independent travel. It's a really amazing opportunity to gain independence. There's also tons of things that we can do in our own backyard, and I will go over Vermont-centric things in a minute, but you don't have to go to Bhutan to have a great gap year. I know I talk a lot about, and I just naturally talk about all the things you can do all over the world, but the most important thing about a gap year is that you're just getting out of your bubble. So that means that you're actively seeking out new communities, new people, new experiences. But that can be done hyper-locally if it needs to be. So working, interning, volunteering, all that stuff at the local level. There's also destination work. That's one of my students in the Alps because he was lucky enough to have dual citizenship and he could work in Switzerland on his gap year, and so he did. But if you're not lucky enough to have dual citizenship like him, you can work in Colorado or Oregon or Maine or somewhere else and earn money, live at a resort with other young people, and earn money to put towards college or later in your gap year. You can also do personal projects. So there's lots of students, I've worked with students here in Vermont that want to hike the Long Trail. So they work towards that. They build up their skills in camping and hiking and that kind of stuff. There's also students who want to start their own business or who want to buy a van and drive it across the country, all those kinds of things. And then there's also work exchange. If you've heard of Woofing or Workaway, these are platforms where you can actually find other hosts, basically, all over the country and internationally who are willing to take you in, house you, feed you, and you have to exchange your labor for them. So usually this is like a farm. I know this sounds so sketchy, but it's actually really fun and a great way to travel. It's very inexpensive. I've done it in many countries myself. Most memorably on a goat farm in New Zealand where my job was to walk the goats, which I learned later is not a thing, but they were just a lovely retired couple who had hobby goats that were really fat, so they needed to be walked. And so this is an amazing cultural exchange opportunity, and you often gain a lot of skills. Even though the goats were not a skill-building experience, those people had a great garden. I learned how to tend chickens, I learned how to start a garden, and now that I'm a homeowner, I use those skills every spring, and I think about them fondly. This picture is actually from a site visit I did in Costa Rica last year, and that's the host of the farm giving the volunteers a tour of a stucco bathroom that he built from scratch. So lots of cool skills you can gain from doing work exchanges as well. So building out what this looks like for you, this is the framework I use with all of my students. You want to think about what you want on the personal level, what you need on the practical level, and what you want on the professional level. So this is a brainstorming exercise that everybody can do. What do you want to do for yourself? Practice that language you learned in high school, try skiing for the first time. That's not as much a Vermont thing, but visit that cousin that lives away and you don't get to see that often. The practical stuff is all the life skills that you need to function as an adult with. And then maybe those professional things, like people usually say, for whatever reason that I like writing, maybe I'll be a journalist. Well, let's figure out a way for you to try it out on your gap year and see if that is gonna stick, or see if actually it was just an idea. And think about how powerful it would be before you step into a college classroom to know, I don't wanna be a doctor, which I figured out on my gap year, and now I have so much money and time and to figure out what I do wanna do. So this is Julian, and he was one of the reasons he took a gap year was not because he didn't know what he wanted to do, but because he wanted that extra experience in his areas of interest. So he had not much work experience, so he did spend the first half of his year working in his hometown at a cheese shop. He said that the most important thing about that was learning how to communicate with people who were not his own age. After the holidays, he went to London. He did this art program for 6 weeks where he got to visit all these different museums, all these different art houses, and learn all about design, which was important because now he's at Parsons and he's working in design. And then he traveled for 6 weeks in Europe with a gap year program with other young people. So that's another diverse set of experiences, but it was very different from what Elsa did. That was, the half and half. So I'm not going to go through each of these individually because time, but this is just a sampling of things that you can do here in Vermont that don't have to be, again, a world away. So there's things that you can, if you have if you took a field trip as a kid to some place and you're like, that place was so cool, there's probably an internship at that place. The cool thing about Vermont is that it's so small scale that someone knows somebody at any of these places. Or you can cold email them or cold call them and say, I'm really interested in the work you're doing. How can I support it? And many Vermonters build out their gap year experiences in that way. So just think about what that could look like for you. Walker is a Vermonter who he's at college. He's in his freshman year now. He took his gap year last year. And he's a great example of someone who earned their way through their gap year. So he started by working landscaping in Shelburne. Then he went to Belize and worked at a monkey rehabilitation center. He was in charge of 2 baby monkeys that were being rehabbed for release, and he was like their caretaker. He came home for the holidays and was applying to colleges, so he was applying on his gap year. And then he went back out and worked at a different wildlife center in Thailand, and then he traveled through Europe with work exchanges at different farms throughout Switzerland and Italy. So that's another example of someone who kind of did back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. But he self-funded almost all of his gap year. His parents gave him a little bit of money to support him, but he did a lot of this on his own dime through the working and saving. So how could that look for you? I also am noticing that it is, wait, I have until 5? Yeah, oh, good, okay, great. We've got loads of time. Okay, great. So gap year finances. A gap year can be financially feasible for every family. And this is how. Everybody has a different starting point. So some people have more to invest in a gap year, and other people have energy and enthusiasm and support to invest in a gap year. And either is great and both is even better. But what I will say is that one thing to think about as a family is how much money am I willing to invest in helping make sure that my young adult is going to have the best possible post-secondary experience. Because especially if you've got our floater Timothy from earlier, that guy needs a little bit of time and maybe a little bit of investment in order to make an investment in college work. And so that uncertainty of what you want to use your college education for needs to be part of the idea of how much you're willing to put into the gap year experience. A lot of times, I mean, if you know the national statistics, you know that we have a 30% dropout rate of freshman year. So a lot of students not making it through freshman year of college. And it takes an average American 6 years to graduate with their undergrad degree as a result of changing majors or switching schools. So if you can front load some of that exploration into a gap year, the stats do show us that gap year students tend to graduate sooner and with higher GPAs than traditional students. So think about that when you're thinking about your starting point and if there's ways to make that expansive as far as what you can put into it. You want to understand the expenses. We kind of touched on some of that in the past thing. So there's going to be program fees involved. There might be flights. There might be, medicines, visas, things like that if you're going to travel internationally. But then there's also resources, and some of them are monetary, and some of them are, again, your network. So the family contribution, maybe parents, maybe there's an aunt that we haven't talked to in a while who's really into travel. Maybe we need to talk to her again. Maybe there's also 529 funds, which we talked about can support certain gap year programs. Students having skin in the game, that's really important. So I have students who start saving as soon as they decide to take a gap year, like 14, 15 years old, and then they have this nest egg that they can do some really cool things with once they actually are on their gap year. You can also fundraise. I don't suggest fundraising if you're like, I'm going to go to Bali and I'm going to sit on the beach, I'm going to have a good time. No one wants to pay for that. But if you're going to be volunteering or doing other types of charitable work, sometimes you can fundraise for that type of experience. Many gap year programs offer scholarships and financial aid. So if you are really excited about a certain program and it's not financially feasible for you, you can connect with that program and see if they can work with you on something, and they often can. And sometimes there's not as many as we would like to see, but there are actual colleges and universities who have gap year funding that they will give to students for their gap years. So Duke University, UNC Chapel Hill, they have scholarship programs endowed into their departments where they will actually shell out some cash so that students can take a gap year. Wait, we forgot one. There we go. Okay, so planning for progression, that means that the amount that you spend on a gap year is not the same month to month. So you may have noticed that Elsa did that more expensive program in Nepal, but then later in her year, she was backpacking through, Australia. So that's a less expensive experience. So you may invest in a more expensive program during part of the year and then offset it with the student working or with maybe living with family or friends or something like that. So when you're thinking about the budget, know that it doesn't have to be even throughout all 12 months or so. And then there are just so many low-cost or no-cost opportunities out there to incorporate into the overall plan. So we've touched on most of them. Grassroots volunteering, that just means that you're going directly to the source of the volunteering rather than going through a big organization that has many international offices. So when I'm working with students, I tend to send students directly to like the Monkey Center in Belize versus going through a sending organization that has external like admin fees and stuff. There's also AmeriCorps, work exchange, au pairing, which is nannying. You can do this, especially in Europe and Australia, New Zealand. They love au pairs. You do have to like children for that one, but if you do like children, that can be a great way to live abroad. With au pairing, you typically pay a small fee to a service to match you with a family, but then you get a living stipend once you're actually in the home with the family and working with the kids. Destination work, that's where you go away and work and earn some money. You can do that all over the United States, but you can also get working holiday visas in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, as long as you're 18 and an American citizen. So if you're feeling really bold, you can go and earn some money in New Zealand on your gap year. And then independent travel and personal projects can really be, you can get creative with how much those cost or don't cost. Now, Michelle is my gold child for showing us how to self-fund a gap year. Michelle was one of those kids who was like, at the age of early high school, was like, I'm taking a gap year. Her parents were like, that's wonderful, you're paying for it. Their contribution was that we were working together. So we were in charge of her budget and making sure that we stretched it. And so her goals were that she really wanted to get fluent in Spanish, and she wanted to get experience in international development, because that's what she thought she wanted to do in college. So she started her gap year, and this is after the summer. So she worked all summer, and then in the fall, she spent 3 months in Guatemala at a language school, really local language school, living with a homestay family, not very expensive. Came home for the holidays, and then in January, she left to work in Oaxaca, Mexico. And she was working for this really cool women's microfinance cooperative. And so she was using that Spanish, increasing her fluency through working at this nonprofit. And she was basically interviewing women who had received microloans to figure out what they were spending their money on, and then bringing that information back to tabulate into the system. And then she ended her year with traveling in Colombia and Peru for 2 months. She is totally my hero. And she's a great example of somebody who can have this type of experience on her own dime. So that is pretty impressive. How she did it? She worked and saved a lot before her gap time. She got $3,000 through a travel grant, and she was really careful about which programs she did to kind of mind that budget. So just know that it is possible if you have dreams of traveling, definitely possible. So, how does this fit in with the college process? I know a lot of you are buzzing probably because that's what you've been focusing on today, and now I'm like derailing everybody by being like, no, wait, this first. The gap year process can actually flow really nicely into the college planning process. If you feel like senior year of high school, you have the information that you need to make a good decision about where you want to go to school, apply senior year, because that's when you have the resources, it's when you have momentum from your classmates and all of that kind of stuff. And then when you start to hear back in the spring of senior year, you can actually request a deferral from most colleges. Not all, but most. So you want to kind of make sure that you're tracking this when you're tracking where you're applying to schools. But typically what the process is that we'll use UVM as an example because they are very deferral friendly. You get your admission from UVM, you're like, yay, you put down your deposit, so that confirms you as a student. Then there's going to be a grace period, so from usually May 1st through sometime in the summer, where you can actually write a letter called a deferral letter, where you list out why you want to take a gap year, what your general plans are for your gap year, how it's going to make you an even more awesome student once you start at UVM. You send it off to your admissions contact, and they say, oh, this looks so amazing. Yes, rubber stamp. And then you're on your way. Then you get to go do your gap year adventures, and then you start the following fall with the next class. Easy. And many, many colleges across the states have a similarly easy deferral policy. The exceptions off the top of my head would be UMass Amherst, and then the University of California school system. They're just a huge school system, and they so much bureaucracy, so that it's not that they don't like gap years, they just don't have the time to process those kinds of deferrals. So, a lot of students, especially since the pandemic, are like, I can't apply, I don't know enough. That's fine. Just make sure that you're working time into your gap year to do what you need to do to get those applications out the door. So for Walker, he came home in October, like late October, and he had all of November and all of December to kind of finalize his applications. He also strategically did something really interesting in the first half of his gap year, and he wrote about that in his essays. And I'm not here to tell you that doing cool things on your gap year is going to make the difference of getting into a school versus not, but it doesn't hurt. Typically what I hear from college admissions officers is that gap years are either neutral or positive when you're doing interesting things that are adding to your dynamic, portfolio as a student. So just, pay attention to that decision, and then just know that when it comes to FAFSA, you will obviously reapply to FAFSA while you're on your gap year. You sometimes will get a different package than the first year. So that's another thing to be cognizant of if you get an amazing package from a school or from FAFSA or anything like that, and it seems like you don't want to roll the dice again, that's another situation in which a gap year at that moment may not be the right choice. But for most people, sometimes the merit scholarships or other types of financial aid will actually defer along with your admission, and that's just a question that you can ask your admissions contacts when the time comes. So we come to the end. When I am talking with students, especially students who are already in college or who've graduated, and I ask them, these are not students I've worked with or students who've taken a gap year, but the ones who haven't, I asked them why they didn't take a gap year or didn't consider it. And it wasn't because they couldn't afford it or because they didn't know about it or because they didn't think they could find cool stuff to do. It was because they had some sort of internal shutdown switch that just said like, nope, it's too different. It's too off the track. And I think that people need a little bit of buoying. These are all quotes from students that have taken gap time. And I think that it helps to know that in the course of my work, I have not come across a student who's regretted taking a gap year. And if you talk to adults, especially if you can find an adult in your life who took a gap year, who had a really impactful travel experience or study abroad experience, they will light up. They won't shut up about it, honestly. And I think that that's really indicative, or it showcases the power of this period of time. It's a really magical period of time, and it is more complicated than just pressing a button and applying to a school, but it pays you back in dividends. And so if this sounds like a compelling idea for you or your kid, or for those of you out there, the people who are in your life who could benefit from this, especially your friends too. Now you know what a gap year is, and now you know how to build one. So definitely keep considering it. And at least, and even if you don't take a gap year, considering a gap year and saying like, that's cool, not for me, you will be, again, stepping into that decision with more clarity and more sense of purpose than having not considered a gap year at all. So there's many ways to keep this conversation going. These are great resources. We've got the Gap Year Association, which many of you have materials for from my table. Go Overseas is an awesome website for finding gap year programs and reading reviews from previous students. Serve, Learn, Earn Vermont, that's, I guess, the right combination of those words. Great, AmeriCorps program right here in our state. They're affiliated with several different nonprofits here, and they have year-long and partial year volunteer options. My podcast, that QR code will allow us to stay in touch if you'd like to do so. And then lots of other ways to find me on the internet. But, I just want to call our attention to the gap year planning tips, and then I'll take some questions. But, making sure that you're just brainstorming those goals and building your gap year from your own goals, rather than if you type in gap year programs into Google, you're going to get overwhelmed so fast. So starting from what do you love to do? I had so many great conversations today with people just asking that, and then being like, oh, you like history? Let's talk about interning at a museum, or let's talk about going to Southeast Asia and visiting the Angkor Wat temples and those kinds of things. So figure out what you already like doing and build from there. And ask around, because a lot of times your network will unlock opportunities that you didn't even know about. You might have that family member who has an internship option, or you might have somebody who has a free bedroom to stay in Portland, Oregon, or stuff like that. So your network can sometimes be a really powerful resource for finding especially those cool opportunities, or sometimes housing or other resources. So with that said, I know we only have a couple minutes, but I want to make sure I at least make us available for a question or two. Do we have anything on Zoom? Do we want to start there? Okay, quiet on Zoom. Anyone in the audience have any questions that we didn't cover?
Yeah, so you have a student that makes it through the first semester and figures out, like, I cannot do this going into the spring semester. Is it considered a gap year if they go then, or is it considered dropping out, or what is it?
Oh, I definitely prefer a rebrand of dropout to gap year student, for sure. Okay. And that is actually a really common type of gapper, is someone who just, didn't find the right spot or didn't find success at first. Just, put in that leave of absence form, and basically anything that we just talked about could be applicable to that kind of student as well.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Describe your services. Your services, consulting. I mean, you typically have one or two conversations with the student and family, and then they're on their own, or you stay with the student and family throughout the year. How does that work?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I am officially here in my capacity as just educator, but because you asked, I'll talk a little bit about the services. I do have 1 hour family consults if you just are quick and dirty, we just need a little bit of advice, so there is that option. But typically students will work with me for the whole planning process, which is from usually sometimes senior year through the end of their gap year. And so the first phase is kind of the planning phase, where I do have conversations with the family as well, but mostly one-on-one with the student, really trying to empower them in the process. And we identify those goals together, we identify the other parameters, anything health and safety wise or budget and that kind of stuff. And then I actually start sending them menus, finite menus of options, usually 5 or 6 things at a time. And we build from those recommendations towards the itinerary. So it'll be, over the course of, I've been doing this for 16 years, believe it or not, and I've visited in person many gap year programs, and I have a database of programs that I draw from when I'm making those recommendations. So I'm really thinking about how can we craft this really personalized period of time for this particular student? And if they don't want to do programs, then we build out an itinerary of independent stuff as well. And usually it's a combination. So I might have students do 2 or 3 different experiences that are programmatic, but then they're also, traveling with friends and Europe for a few weeks and we build out their itinerary together and stuff like that. So that is part of the planning process. And then I'm checking in with them throughout their year as well in case they need my support. And we do mid-year and end of year check-ins as well, just for debriefing and stuff. So a lot of processing, a lot of reflection. It's kind of a combination of travel advising and mentorship. It's super fun. Thanks. Yeah, Zoom question.
How far in advance do students need to begin planning? Is second semester senior year too late to do so?
That is such a good question. I would say that junior year is the time to dream. Or sophomore year, if we have sophomores in the room. So that's the time to get this general information and start thinking about like what a gap year could look like and start saving. Senior year is when we actually put, pedal to the metal on the planning. And typically it does start second semester senior year. So it's not too late. In fact, I have students come to me in April, May, and June are some of my busiest months because usually you're waiting to hear back from colleges to say like, yes, we're definitely doing this and I'm deferring and now I'm gonna like actually put these plans in place. So you kind of wanna start, if you know that you wanna take a gap year, start earlier, but if you are in the position where you're just coming to it now, you got time and you can have just as good a gap year. And same thing for those students who may have, deciding over Thanksgiving break that they don't want to go back to school for second semester of college, any of those years, you can actually pull together some really cool plans if you kind of just are really active and good at decision making. So, great. Thank you so much, and I hope that this was inspiring and informative, and thank you all for making the time to come today and learn more about just the college process, and I hope all the sessions were amazing. So I'll stick around if anyone has personal questions, but otherwise have a great evening. Thanks.